a long weekend and it's not like those Friday evening lectures where we have an excuse saying traffic may first day again. I talked to people who said they waited 30 minutes and they were expecting to come in 45. So great to see all of you here on a Saturday afternoon. So nice of you to be here. It's a therefore great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Giridhar and I am from Azim Premji. It's a great pleasure to invite Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, who is a Professor of Environmental Studies and History and Dean of Academic Affairs at Ashoka University. Multifaceted, author, academic, historian, researcher, Mahesh has taught at Delhi, Yadavpur, Cornell, and NCBS. He's also been the director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. It was Fencing the Forest, written about 22 years ago. He wrote Nature and Nation. In his work is At Nature's Edge, co-edited with Gunnel Cederlof this year. At Nature's Edge is also, as you know, the title of his talk today. Mahesh and his considerable, and I will not go into that, but permit me to just share a couple of facets of Mahesh that endear him so much to me personally and to all the people who come in touch with him. Mahesh is, of course, a scholar of considerable repute. Scholarship extremely lightly. So lightly that he includes everyone whom he meets in a conversation, and within minutes it's clear that he is more interested in your work and knowing more about your work than in talking about his work. So that's a fantastic quality. And therefore, I think that's something that will attract Mahesh to anybody who meets him even in a few minutes. Mahesh is a fascinating speaker. That needs no introduction. But I had a personal experience of it some time ago and determined that within the next 4 months, I must get Mahesh on behalf of Azim Premji University to come and give a public lecture. So it's a matter of great delight that we have Mahesh with us, and the floor is yours, Mahesh. Welcome. He's a fascinating speaker. We are in for a treat.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Working? Yeah. Thank you, Giridhar, for a very generous, if wildly inaccurate introduction. I think, broadly agreed upon that the environmental dilemma or the ecological danger which we find ourselves in the midst of today probably has no precedent in human history. Now, I know this is said about a range of other equally pressing political and social issues. And it is said about all these issues as much about the environmental dimension, because we do live in times of very epochal change. There's a very fascinating book brought out a few years ago called The Great Acceleration. And just to stay with one statistic, it says that 3/4 of all the carbon dioxide which has been generated by humans and other greenhouse gases were generated since 1945. So those of us who lived through this period are living through epochal changes. Some of these are known to us. We're meeting in September of 2018, and just about 100 years ago, the Great War or the First World War came to an end. It saw the death of over 25 million people. Not very long after, depending on where you date it, I would date the Second World War as beginning in 1936, when Italy invaded Abyssinia, or 1937 when Japan invaded China. But we all know that it ended in 1945. So the century that has passed was a century of great human suffering, including huge wars that we fought with each other. And the latter half of the 20th century, as we all know, in a sense begins with the UN Charter being adopted. And the UN Charter stated that having seen the scourge of war twice in our lifetime, all the peoples of the world aspire to a period of peace. It's paradoxical that this was adopted at a time of a very important environmental watershed, because as we know, it's in 1944-45 that we had the first atomic tests and the first use of atomic weapons, both at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Writing in a famous book, Jonathan Schell said that nuclear weapons not only changed the relationship of humans to life, it also meant that it was possible not only to foresee the extremely serious chance that we would see the end of life, that we may also have to live through the death of death. So if there were no life, there would be no death. and we'd be left with a republic of insects and grass. So this unleashing of this huge potential for war making did not exhaust itself in 1945. We entered into another period which entered just 30 years ago, the period of the Cold War, which we ought to remind ourselves for many peoples in Africa, Asia, Latin America, was not just a Cold War, but a war which saw the loss of very precious human lives. What I think is significant about the environmental issue is that it reminds us that the search for peace among people, the search for freedom of nations, the search for equality across the lines of gender, class, caste, race, sexual orientation, and what have you, that is the idea that all humans ought to have equal rights to freedom and dignity. It takes this very simple idea, very difficult idea to attain in practice, but very noble and significant idea because it has animated and transformed the lives of so many. It takes this simple idea and expands it. It tries to expand it to other species. It tries to expand it to other generations. It tries to expand it to other landscapes and seascapes. Years ago, we were in a debating competition, and I had a younger friend who had a far better sense of humor than I ever will, and we were speaking about nuclear weapons, and he said, "Madam Chairperson, the problem of nuclear weapons is not that we will all die. It is that I might survive, but my grandchild may be born with 99 teeth and a tail." Now, this, of course, has never happened. We know that in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, nobody is born with 99 teeth and a tail. But I think there's something very significant when humans acquire the capability to make chemical compounds or to unleash the genie in the atom, which can have side effects and consequences beyond anyone living today. And this profound transformation has, of course, led to a great change in consciousness. We could come up with our own markers for the time of environmental awakening. For me, it would be one. In 1972, for the very first time, the United Nations decided to hold a conference of the human environment. They chose a delightful and beautiful city, very famous because that's where the Nobel Peace Prize is announced, Stockholm. And Stockholm is an appropriate place. It's one of the few great European cities which escaped the bombings of the Second World War. But interestingly, there were only two heads of government who found the time to be at Stockholm. One was Olof Palme of Sweden, but he had to be there because he had to welcome the other delegates. But the other was Indira Gandhi of India. But it's significant that where in 1972, there were two heads of government in Stockholm, if you go and look at the later UN environment conferences, such as the one which is held in 2009 in Copenhagen, Copenhagen saw a very important moment when the leaders of the developing world, Brazil, India, China, were sitting in a room and President Obama walked in early. He actually knocked on the door, came in and said, "Do you mind if I join you, even though, we are ahead of schedule?" And the President of the United States comes through, even someone as, cultured, composed, and charming as Barack Obama, you can't really say no. And they sat down and tried to hammer out a deal. So what is it that has changed? That an issue such as the environment, a word such as ecology, which 50 years ago, 70 years ago was known to a handful of people, has suddenly become so important that major world leaders gather together and at least claim that they're trying to do something about it. Recently, I was trying to teach students about animal histories, and I was explaining the significance of the city of Vladivostok. Vladivostok has many reasons to be recorded in the annals of history. One of them is that it hosted an international tiger summit, because as you know, Russia has a large population of Amur tigers. Virtually all the world's Amur tigers live in Russia. There's a small number in China. And the president of Russia wanted to be seen with other world statesmen and women saving the tiger. So there's something very profound in the period we're living through. Just at the time our ability to transform our environment has grown beyond measure, so has our consciousness that we ought to do something to protect it. This leads, of course, to a question. Protect it from what? Protect it for what? Protect it from whom? I'm sure that all of you have heard famous rock and pop songs which have the following line, "I want to be free." It's a very nice line, but it doesn't ask any questions. Free from what? Free for what? Free from whom? Now, if you're a student in a classroom, you want to say you want to be free from the class teacher. If you're someone working in a factory, you say you want to be free from the factory siren, and so on and so forth. But I think that there's something very significant, that this idea of the environment, the idea that nature needs protection, has become politically charged, contested in our own world of today. You see this in a range of countries. We went through a very important election in the United States a few years ago where Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. And one of the places which became prominent in the campaign was a town called Flint, where there was lead and other substances in the water. And needless to say, the people who were worst affected by this were people of color or people who were underprivileged. You see it in a country such as India, where there is not a single city or single town which has 24 hours of assured, portable drinking water for all its citizens. Even places which earlier were known to have adequate rainfall and lots of water have very little. When you look at the larger map, you look at a very big transformation that is taking place. In his book, Something New Under the Sun, John McNeill argues that the 20th century is a remarkable century. It's not only remarkable because of the reasons I said, the search for an end to wars, the war to end all wars, the war that ended the peace, the Cold War which turned hot. It is also significant because it saw a huge increase in the number of people on earth, and even more than that, in the amount of wealth we produce. Even more than that, in the amount of energy we consume. So if you added up all the people of the earth, there were 4 times as many by 2000 as there were in 1900. If you look at the gross world product, if you added, aloo parathas and makalu burgers and tikkis and steel and salmon and ores and everything, the gross world product grew 14-fold. The amount of energy grew 16-fold. We all like to think that we are powerless. It might tempt you and make you feel very powerful. But McNeill argues that any one of us in this room, when we put on a light switch, has more power than any of the rulers, the ancient kings and emperors and queens. There's so much of energy, which is not through human muscle, not through animal muscle, but through fossil fuel, which is available at the flick of a light bulb. So this huge transformation has opened up great opportunities for people. They live longer. We eat better. We dress better. We are able to get around the planet much faster. But it's also come at an enormous cost. And it is adding up these costs, asking who is paying the cost, who is paying the price, who is in a sense reaping the harvest that cannot be taken away from the questions of the environment. Let me illustrate. One of the great changes, of course, which comes about in the 20th century is the change because of something called the Haber-Bosch process. There's a very interesting scholar called Václav Smil who points out that we are all obsessed with the carbon cycle today because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. There's a lot of debates about what is more dangerous for methane, buffaloes and cows and pigs or gas-guzzling cars. Now, irrespective of how you answer that, the transformation in terms of nitrogen is equally significant. In 1909, the scientists Fritz Haber and Bosch worked out something called the Haber-Bosch process. They synthesized ammonia, and something humans had done for 8, 10, 12,000 years, tried to increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil, because as you all remember your school time chemistry, plants need N, P, and K in order to grow, and the more nitrogen that there is, the plant can absorb it, and it can put out more leaves, it can put out more seeds, and so on and so forth. The Haber-Bosch process helped to power, along with a whole lot of other changes, the huge surge in the production of agriculture. It raised per acre output. It enabled cultivators not only to raise production, but to earn more incomes. It enabled consumers not only procure more food and other crops, but do so at a lower cost. This is a profound transformation. Everyone in this room, in fact anyone on earth, has gained from this huge new transformation, which did not involve fixing the nitrogen in the air with leguminous plants. It did not involve getting guano from the Pacific Islands. It did not involve other ways of fertilizing the soil through nitrogen. They work, but none of them works quite as miraculously. This has come at a huge cost. Across the world, in the seas, in the lakes, in the rivers, in the ponds, the excess nitrogen, which is not taken in by the plant, is drained away, it leaches in the groundwater, it hits the surface water, and it ends up in a body of water where the amount of nitrogen is so large that it causes algal blooms, and it fundamentally alters the way the ecosystems in the marine world work. So the unintended consequences of the human endeavor to improve the human condition have been a huge part of the story of our transformation of the environment. It's not like the film Avatar, which I'm sure all of you see, or the other film which has been made, I believe, in Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Hindi, Jurassic Park in its various versions. There's a good guy and a bad guy. Though it's a sign of our times that by the time you come to the end of Jurassic Park, you wish this huge dinosaur ate up this awful man who was the financier who was doing all this. So I think that there's a lot about the environment which isn't about heroes and villains. It isn't T-Rex as the hero or bad banker as the villain or vice versa. It's about asking, why is it these changes which were unleashed, which also brought a lot of benefits, all came with costs which we are unable to control, which we are unable to weigh up? Is it because this knowledge was not present with us? Or perhaps is it also because we have not asked the most important and simple of questions? When did we take critical turns in the road? As I suggested, one of them is supposed to be the period after 1945, which saw this great acceleration in economic and technological growth. The other is the idea that the 20th century in any case was marked by vast changes. Because of the great debate on global warming, which, pardon the expression, has heated up since the 1980s and the 70s, many scholars trace the transformation to the Industrial Revolution. The 1780s, when there was a possibility that one of the advanced countries on earth, and remember, in the 1780s or 60s, countries such as India or China may have got there first. There are many reasons that England got there first. Someone in England not just figured out how to get coal out of the bowels of the earth, someone who was willing to put up the capital and the technology, and this marked the beginning of what may quite rightly be called the age of steam. It's tempting to think this was the big change. But sitting as we are in a part of Asia, where agriculture dates back 8, 10, 12,000 years, I think we should remind ourselves that this was not the first time that humans began to impact the earth in many ways. We're so used to thinking of agriculture as a way of life that we rarely pause to think that the 6, 8, 10, 12 food crops, which account for 70, 80% of the food of people on earth, have not just been procured from the wild, they've been crossbred, selectively domesticated, tamed, transformed into agro-ecosystems, not now, not yesterday, but 8, 10, 12,000 years ago. This didn't happen in one place. There's no one magic moment. Earlier, people thought it first happened in Mesopotamia. Now we are told it also happened in China. It also happened in South Asia. Next time you eat aloo ka paratha, which you can figure out is one of my favorite dishes, or you bite a chili and you reach for a glass of water, which I did at lunch, or you decide that you're going to have tomato salad, you have to thank those people who transformed their wild relatives into cultivars in parts of the Andes in Latin America. These crops are part of our world only because of the Iberian, the Portuguese, the Spanish reaching there in the 1490s, the 1510s, the 1520s, and within less than the space of a century, every Pargana district in the Mughal Empire was reporting that the Rayats, farmers, were growing, believe it or not, chili, tobacco, and potato. So this transformation of the earth has been something which is very important to the human condition. It's true, we're living at a time when the expansion of agriculture threatens the survival not just of forest, but of scrubland. It threatens not only scrubland, but marshes, estuaries, places which are very important for biological diversity. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that the human engagement with nature has not all been about destruction. It's also been about improvement. It's also been about other transformations. You all know that just over 100 years, little less than 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago, in the 1920s, there were very important discoveries in the Indus Valley. My distinguished colleague, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, has written a book which ranks for me with any mystery thriller. It's called Finding Forgotten Cities. It's about how John Marshall put together the mystery of who built these huge cities in the valley of the Indus, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. So the coming of cities marked another transformation. We are meeting, of course, in the city of Bangalore, and Professor Harinya Nagendra, who's one of the among the many distinguished faculty of Azim Premji University in her work, reminds us that Bangalore has a history of over half a millennium. Many transformations have taken place in Bangalore in this half a millennium. One of them is that the floral complexion of Bangalore has changed. Many of the trees we associate with this city, the copper pod, for example, the people, the neem, are not native to this area. They've been naturalized by humans. So just as humans took our friends the potato, the maize, the brinjal and others from one continent to another, we also took trees from one part of India to another. And a tree such as the neem, which incidentally is a native of the India-Burma border, has for centuries become part not only of the living ecology, but even the cultures and the lifestyles of so many people across this vast subcontinent. We could go further back in time. There's fascinating work by Michael Adams where he argues that humans who sailed on what we would today incorrectly, unfairly label as primitive craft. You suppose you're riding in a motorboat or a jolly boat, you might think that these little crafts and rafts are primitive. There was nothing primitive about them. 50,000 years ago, they were extremely sophisticated. The men and women who boarded them in Asia charted their journey across these vast oceans. Those of you who have seen Life of Pi will sympathize with them, though they didn't have a tiger sitting on the boat called Pi. They managed to reach Australia, where over the next 45,000 years, they and an animal which accompanied them, the dingo, helped to transform the ecology of Australia. The dingo, of course, is probably, according to DNA work, descended from various species of canids, which are found on the Asian mainland. Some say it was the Indian wolf, some say it was a dog from the mainland of Southeast Asia. We don't know. That's a mystery. What we do know is that within a few thousand years, on the island of Australia, several of the large marsupials, which weighed over 50 kg or 30 kg, vanished. So this transformation by the Aborigines, on the one hand, meant the extermination unintentionally. They didn't set out to say, oh, we're going to eliminate all these marsupials. It's just that they unleashed certain changes which harmed them. But they brought about other changes which benefited other animals. When I say Australia, you think of two animals, the grey kangaroo and the red kangaroo. They're enormous animals, they jump huge distances, and they're very charming. But their numbers are greater today than ever before because these Aborigines not only adapted to the land, they learnt about its vegetation, they used fire to open up large areas of grassland and expanded the range and the habitat of animals like the grey and the red kangaroo. So where are we then? One of the key points I think that we learn from the larger historical record is that it's difficult to find an original state of nature. Now, I want to explain why I am saying this. I'm not saying this because I think we ought not to have conservation or preservation. So if somebody wants to, and there are very powerful people who want to, put a 6-lane highway through the Cobbett Park, Cobbett Park, Asia's first national park, named after Malcolm Haley, created in 1937, unusual park, renamed, believe it or not, after an Englishman in 1955, because the Indians in Uttarakhand believed that Colonel Jim Cobbett, who had left India and gone away to Kenya, had done great service to the people of the hills in those areas by staking his life when hunting, man-eating leopards and tigers. They rename it the Cobbett Park, becomes India's first tiger reserve, and will soon be distinguished, unless the court intervenes and public opinion halts government, by the fact that there will be a 6-lane highway running right through its heart. So when I say nature is not pristine, nature is not untouched, I don't mean there should be a highway through Cobbett Park. I'm not arguing that. What I am arguing is that while we do need to have spaces for nature, where we don't have 6-lane highways, mines, dams, lots of land cleared for, we need all of that. At the same time, it's important to realize that the human interface with nature is much more complex than simply being a destroyer or a protector. A range of spaces of grey lies between them. There's a reason for this, and the reason is very significant. Even those who believe that we ought to protect nature or conserve nature don't often agree on what constitutes nature. Think of something very, very simple. Everyone in this room would have seen one or the other versions of the most famous book on India written by someone who had never set foot in an Indian forest, Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling lived in the Punjab. He wrote for the Civil and Military Gazette. He never visited central India, but he had something remarkable. He had the gift of the pen. And in the 1890s, he wrote the first essay which went into the Jungle Book called In the Rook. In the Rook begins with great paeans of praise to the Forest Service, and he says that the Imperial Forest Service is as important to the British Imperial Army. The army, he says, quells rebellion, but the Imperial Service protects the forests, and it's from the forests that the mighty timber and planks come, which are used to build the railways. And when troops go out to crush the rebellions, they use the railways. Now, the hero of the story, of course, is our friend Mowgli. Now, you all know Mowgli was supposed to have been raised by wolves, but you may not recall that when he became older, he not only got married, He got a job. Naukri ho gayi. As they say in North India, Naukri lag gayi ji, service lag gayi Mowgli ki. Service kahan lagi? He joined the forest service. And according to Kipling, his job was to protect the young saplings, drive away the goats of the villagers, and ensure these saplings would grow up to be mighty oaks. So the protection of the forest was a claim on nature. It was a claim by some people over other people. Some who had rights lost them, and some others asserted their power over nature. This is something very significant across the world. The issue of who controls nature, who defines how to protect nature, cannot be taken out of the debates on the future of the environment. We are not simply debating the past. We are also thinking about the future. During my bachelor's in Oxford, I had one great privilege. I didn't know it at the time. I discovered it many years later. My tutor, Maurice Keene, appeared in a novel by Frederick Forsyth. You can later find out which one it was. Maurice Keene wrote his doctoral work on the outlaws of medieval legend. And one of the characters is known to everyone in this room, Robin Hood. So we had finished a tutorial and I said, Maurice, what did they do to you in Norman England if you had poached the king's deer? Did they cut off your head? No, he was a very serious historian. So he waited a few minutes and he said, they weren't quite so cruel, you know. They couldn't give you capital punishment without a jury. And a jury required 12 freemen. So instead of cutting off your head, they'd probably deprive you of an arm, a leg, or your thumb. This is very interesting. You see, if they cut off your thumb, you can never again wield a bow and arrow. So I think this is something very significant, that this ability of powerful groups to corner nature for their own ends is not something new. It's something which defines power very early on. One of the animals, as you know, which is very well known in India, in 2010 was declared our national heritage animal. We already had a national animal, the tiger. We got a national aquatic animal, the dolphin. But since, you know, it's nice to have a Trimurti, they decided to make the elephant the national heritage animal. Now, one of the features of the elephant, of course, is that the elephant has been protected in many parts of Asia for centuries. The great scholar Thomas Trotman wrote a book in which he argued that kingship in South Asia, from the times of the Mauryas and earlier, this is 2,300 years ago, long time, 23 centuries, was defined by the fact that the king had the right and the power, the king and later the emperor, to capture elephants in large forests known as Hastavana. Anyone else who went and tried to kill or capture an elephant, there were no juries and freemen here. They cut off your head. Or they used some other gory methods which I will not share in such polite company. But more importantly, Trotman shows that this relationship of the king and the elephant involved two other entities. The king, by controlling the elephant, asserted control over the forest. So there are very interesting rules spelled out in the Arthashastra, which of course is an ideal text, not exactly how things happen, but it's based on some things that did happen, that the breadth of the road in the Hastavana had to be 1/3 of that in the city. It's very interesting. So there's a notion of the integrity of the Hastavana. But the other is that the king stood in relation to forest peoples. Now to go there and protect the elephants or to catch them. Remember, they had to be caught for the army. That's why they were being protected. They were not being protected only because the emperors and kings loved them. Of course they did. But they loved them even more because these elephants were deprived of their freedom and liberty and dignity and pressed into service in the armies. And this transformation of the elephant into a fighting machine helped it win a lease of life, not just in large parts of India, but across Asia. It's difficult to conceive of it, but the Seleucids, who descended from Seleucus, the emperor, the general who fought for Alexander and whose wife married Chandragupta Maurya, so I won't get into that. These elephants, such elephants, were trapped across West Asia. So at that time you had elephants in parts of Syria, the Tigris-Euphrates basin. And this elephant-keeping culture spreads across the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. It stops at the borders of China. And the great historian of China, Mark Elvin, tells us that in China the relationship of state power and elephants was completely different. He calls his 4,000 year history of the environment in China the retreat of elephants. There were elephants in large parts of China. There weren't as many as India. Their densities were lower. But over time, with the advance of rice cultivation and Han Chinese agriculture, the elephant retreated. Don't blanch. because I think we should be careful when we discuss other people's cultures and food preferences. But in much of Southeast and South Asia, other than a few Adivasi or tribal peoples, elephants are not eaten. They are in China. So if you read old Chinese tracts, the killing of elephants was seen as part of a mission of civilizing China, of expanding the agrarian frontier, and the eating of elephants, including delicacies such as roast elephant trunk, was regarded as essential to civilizing and transforming the land. I'm emphasizing this because I think today we tend to see the human-nature conflict as all humans against nature, as the human species versus the environment. One of the most distinguished historians of our time, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty of Chicago, has written 2 phenomenal papers on climate change, where he argues that the earlier histories were about people and classes and gender and nations. But now we need to think of a common history of humanity versus nature. Sure, but all of us, while we have something in common as humans, also have uncommon pasts. We don't necessarily share the same lineages, but more importantly, we don't share the same histories. The reason is that this huge impact on nature, in this case, the protection of the elephant, for statist reasons, the annihilation of the elephant, for statist reasons, has left different legacies in different parts of the planet. I began by referring to the elections in the United States. As you are well aware, one of the very important events in the 1960s was the transformation of environmental consciousness in the United States with the publication in 1962 of a remarkable book, Silent Spring. It was written by a woman. There are many distinguished women academics in the room, and with the greatest respect to all of you and the men, I think in some sense, Rachel Carson had a greater impact on our understanding of the environment, even though she didn't have what you need to get a job in most respectable universities, a PhD. The reason she didn't have a PhD is it was very difficult for a woman to fulfill the ambition of doing a PhD in the biological sciences in the United States of the 40s and 50s. But she had something many people who had PhDs didn't have. She had the gift of synthesis. She was already a well-known writer. She'd written 3 great bestsellers on the sea. And in 1962, she published a remarkable book called Silent Spring. It asked a very simple question. It said there was a town in the heart of America where something snuffed out the songs that marked the coming of spring. And she asked, what is it that has silenced the voices of spring across America? In one of her most celebrated chapters, she showed that the spraying of pesticides resulted in their accumulation in the leaf litter, their transmission into the soil, their ingestion by earthworms, the consumption of the earthworms by songbirds, and the inability of those songbirds, even when they mated, even when they laid eggs, to hatch the eggs because the embryo was dead and the eggshell was too thin. And she chose a bird very beloved of Americans, the robin. She also put together material which showed that this was happening to an even more important bird in American history, the bald eagle. And she wrote that history will not forgive us, that the bird which is our national emblem, even where we celebrated it for its majesty, we were writing its epitaph. In a sense, Rachel Carson brings together 2 very different kinds of cultures, the culture of science, of observing nature, of understanding the way the world works, and of literature, of writing it in evocative lucid prose, or poetry, or verse, and bringing that message across to such a large number. Now there's something else which strikes me about Silent Spring. It is a book by an American, and it's written for other Americans. But the importance of Silent Spring goes well beyond America. The issues she raised became significant for the whole world. Nowhere was this more significant than in Asia. In 1965, a year after Rachel Carson died, prematurely, because she had cancer. She had cancer when she was writing the book. She had cancer when she was going up to the hearings. She's a woman who signifies the classic David versus Goliath story. But in 1965, not only did the US launch a land invasion of Vietnam, a country against which they never declared war, a few years later, because they were unable to control the guerrillas who were attacking them in South Vietnam, which was the US ally, they decided, why just fight the guerrillas? Why crawl around in the jungles? Why not eliminate the forest? And they unleashed an enormous chemical war on Vietnam. Something like 10, 12, 15% of Vietnam was sprayed with defoliants. One of them would earn notoriety in history. It had a beguilingly lovely name. It sounds like a Holi ka rang. You know, in North India, children play Holi. There's gulal and there's various things. It was called Agent Orange. It's a very lethal substance, Agent Orange. It's a chemical compound, the complexity of which I stopped studying chemistry many, many years ago, 1980 or 81, so I can't remember the compound. But one of the features of this compound is that it doesn't degrade. It doesn't just defoliate the trees. When the leaves fall off the trees, it enters not only the soil, but it enters the water system. So there are large parts of Vietnam which were poisoned with these defoliants. As you're well aware, the people who were spraying it were in planes. They were US Air Force servicemen, and many of them were adversely affected by Agent Orange. About 10, 12 years ago, they went to the US Supreme Court, they fought a very long suit against the US Air Force and won. They were paid damages because of severe health effects of spraying Agent Orange. You know, it seems when you spray this from a plane, all the spray doesn't go to the ground. It can even affect people in the plane. Sadly, no such recourse has been available for either the people in Vietnam affected by the Agent Orange then or affected by it now. This is yet another reason why, while we should emphasize the common dilemma of humanity in how to achieve peace with nature, we should not disassociate this from the larger search for justice. Just as there can't be peace among people without justice among people, just as there can't be peace among nations without justice for all nations, just as the condition of one person's freedom is that all people be free. It's a famous sentence of Abraham Lincoln where he said, a people cannot be, this nation cannot survive half free and half slave. Freedom has to be a condition which includes all. That applies to the human relationship with nature. Where is that not as strongly evident as when we look at a very vexed question of race and caste? One of the countries, of course, which did a remarkable job of saving its large wild animals in the 20th century was South Africa. Already in the 1920s, 10 years before Haley Park, they set up the Kruger National Park. There's a very famous Indian biologist who shall remain nameless, you can guess who it is, went to Kruger Park and came back and called me the next day, it's the days before cell phones, and said, you won't believe where I went. I said, where did you go? He said, Kruger National Park. I said, what's so special about it? He said, you can't imagine. It's 20,000 square kilometers. And he described various wonderful beasts and birds that live in Kruger National Park. But he said, you'd have been especially happy as a historian. I said, why? He said, just like India was 5,000 years ago. It's a very important comment. You believe that you visit a place where nature is preserved and you go back in time. The sense that there's something primeval. It would be, except that like all visitors in Kruger Park, he's not walking around on foot as they did 5,000 years ago. He went in a motor car. And one of the ways that Kruger Park became so important to white South Africa in the 1920s is that the Afrikaans speakers, who's descended from the Dutch Boers, and the English speakers, who were descended from the various English-speaking peoples of the British Isles, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scots, they had to make peace. They'd fought a ferocious war just quarter century before. And one of the ways they made peace was to protect the animals in this park. And you guessed it, go out in motor cars and look at the veld, as the savanna there is called, as it was before they had conquered it. So this idea that you could commune with nature, come close to nature, while having access to the latest technologies of transport. There's a contradiction in this. I'm not suggesting people shouldn't go to Kruger Park or shouldn't drive around in it. I'm just trying to point out that the creation of Kruger was an act of peace among whites. It was also, at least in the 90s, secured against the majority Africans of South Africa. Needless to say, when South Africa saw the abolition and the end of the apartheid era, its first democratic election, 20,000 young African men and women went to the gates of Kruger and demonstrated for 3 days. They wanted to tear down the gates of the park. And in a very important and statesmanlike act, South Africa's President Nelson Mandela appealed to them and argued that while Kruger had been created through a great act of violence, the dispossession of people who lived in the areas that became the park, the exile of those who depended on it for a living, the prevention of any person of color to enter the park except as menials and people providing manual labor. The denial of the joys of seeing the splendors of the park to African school children. He said, I agree with all of that. But the answer is not to abolish the park and tear it apart. It is to make it accessible and open to all South Africans of all classes and races, while acknowledging and providing restitution for those against whom there were injustices committed. How do we do that in the future? Here I have to make a confession. The discipline of history is very good for studying the past. It's not very good for suggesting silver bullet solutions. So next time you see a book which says the question of poverty, causes and cure, it's not by a historian. But much more seriously, there are two things you're warned about when you ask any historian a question. Health warning 1, they'll tell you this problem is not simple, it's complicated. Health warning 2, they'll say the answer is not short, it's long. So you can't go on television because in television programs today, there are programs called The Nation Wants to Know, The World Wants to Know. Before you finish the sentence, somebody will ask you a question. But I still think that history is useful because it gives us a couple of insights. One of the insights is that the issue of nature today is a deeply contested political question. But it is a unique kind of political, social, and cultural question because it demands of us an awareness both of the literary and the scientific cultures. So to go back to Rachel Carson, you need an understanding of the transformations which humans have unleashed on the natural world as much as an appreciation of the human condition. But the other is that it is vital not just to emphasize all the issues on which humans agree, but to also begin to debate peacefully, non-violently, sometimes non-confrontationally, sometimes, this is my personal preference, non-violent resistance. The reasons for which some people, in exerting power over other people, do so by exerting control and dominance over nature. And they do so in ways that not only damage themselves or those they are depriving of access to nature, but leaving a deep imprint, not just on human lives, but on the earth itself. I began by saying we are in an unusual epoch. We are in an epoch without precedent. We are at a time of potentially great perils. But you could flip that aside. You could flip that around. We are living in a time where there is enormous potential. There are fascinating opportunities. There are unknown ways in which those of us who are privileged to live in this time can try to take that old human quest for equality, for dignity, for freedom, and combine that with what is today a necessary challenge for the human condition on the planet, the search for the peace with nature. Thank you.
Was I wildly inaccurate in my introduction? I said he's a fascinating speaker. You can add a couple of more very relevant. I think he's a very compelling, magnetic speaker. Okay. I think the trick is that somehow he starts and then you get immersed and you're inside all the way. Mahesh, it was a privilege to listen to you.
Thank you.
We'll spend some time on questions.
Sure.
These people who know me know I'm an awful moderator. Okay. So what we'll do is I'll just set the basic rules and then it's over to you. You'll manage it better than me. What I suggest is that, Mahesh, if you could take 2 or 3 questions at a time, answer them, and then we'll go for the next set of 2 or 3 questions. We'll spend about half an hour, and if we need a few minutes more, we'll get it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself. And is there a mic or something?
Yeah, there'll be a mic that will go around.
Sorry. Just please introduce yourself. And then please ask whatever you have. And comments are welcome. They don't have to be questions.
I'll go back.
Would you like to begin?
No, I'll go back and sit.
Okay. Thank you.
I did my stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mahesh. My name is Sanjay Anandram. I have a question for you, and this is something that I keep thinking about all the time. It's all very well for, let's say, the West, quote unquote, to talk about environmental degradation, pollution, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is that they grew to where they are today, essentially through a series of several decades long environmental depredations that was funded essentially from the colonies and so on. Now, when countries like India and China, with desperate poverty levels, actually need to do a lot of quote-unquote development to ensure that the lives of the dispossessed and the disadvantaged right, need to be upgraded, and there necessarily needs to be some compromise between that and the need for preserving ecology. And that balance is what everybody is seeking, but nobody quite knows where and how. I wanted to get your sense of what exactly should be the framework of the debate for countries like India and China. Because on a per capita basis, it's significantly lower in consumption of all, let's say, fossil fuels, for example, or whatever else relative to the West. But if you look at it in aggregate terms, the challenge becomes for India and China to start debating all of these issues, right? So how does one frame this? Because these are all wicked problems where the results of any decision will only be known 3, 4, 5 decades downstream. And we don't really have all the information today. So how does one take a call? Because keeping in mind the fact that there are desperately poor people and whose lives need to be upgraded.
Any other question? Take on one more. Yes, sir. Yeah, he's just giving you the mic. Yeah. So, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just like to speak about a common man's problem, especially the Bangalore. If you really think about, it used to be very beautiful, and then we had BBB, that is Bring Back Beauty to Bangalore. I remember the lakes that we had in Bangalore was very beautiful, and we had a lot of parks around. And even where I live, there's a beautiful lake, but it is completely put the trash and other things. Why I'm saying is that, what is that Azim University, Paramji University, and Mahesh Rangarajan can do to have a dialogue with the government or something? Because I know the corruption is the main reason why our environment is not taken care. And I think this is, as a common man, I'm just thinking, how that all this talk and all this, the researchers and all that, how it is going to help the common people, unless there is a real dialogue with the government and where you can change their mood. Now the corruption, and we know the kind of people who are really taking the decisions. So what we can do about it?
Actually, I think both these questions are related. I doubt there is a constituency not only in China or India, but anywhere in the emerging economies, the developing world, which wants a freeze on growth. We mustn't forget that India, China today are among major emerging economies. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions, China is number 1. It's true, it's very low per capita, but you'll all agree that since around the late 1970s, the industrialization and transformation of China has been one of the most remarkable features of the world's history. It's probably on a scale larger than that of the continental United States, of the Soviet Union in its heyday, or of Europe. So I think that China today has a huge global footprint. This is not the China of the early 20th century. In a sense, this is true of India. We tend to forget that India is a very large importer not only of oil, but of coal, even of timber. Both of these countries are beginning to play a much larger role, not only in Asia, but even in Africa. But both of these countries are seeing another transformation, which is linked to your question, sir, which is that a larger number of their citizens are today living in cities. It's about 1 out of 3 Indians. That's a lot of people. 350, 400 million, larger than the population of the United States or Russia, roughly equal to that of Europe. So 350, 400 million people are living in cities. And just as in Bangalore, similarly in China, half of China's people are living in cities. The largest wave of city and town blending on earth is happening in the developing world. Now, there's a very interesting difference between the developing and developed world, certainly in countries in South Asia and Africa. Most of the people living in these countries are self-employed. They have casual labor jobs. One of the results of that is they don't have health cover. They don't have the access to public health, which is available in Europe, North America, Japan, even Russia. Therefore, the big driver today for environmental improvement is coming from their citizens. There's a very interesting Chinese dissident whose name I always forget, but I remember the character. Google him. He writes books called the Inspector Chen Mysteries. He's a remarkable inspector, works in Shanghai. He's not only an inspector of murders, he's a poet. He's secretary of the Chinese Literary Society. So marvelous book of his called Don't Cry Tai Lake. So Inspector Chen, investigator of murders, poet, is also a foodie. So he gets to go on holiday to Tai Lake. He lives in a beautiful mansion owned by the Chinese Communist Party. They own very nice mansions only for their leaders. Good inspector gets a break. He goes there to eat the local duck and fish. They taste very nice, and then the person cooking for him says they're not from Tai Lake. Here all the ducks are dead, the fish are also dead. And he finds that there's a local chemical plant which is polluting it, and I'm sure you've guessed the manager of the plant is murdered, etc., etc., etc. So I think this is a huge crisis happening. There's a remarkable book on China which I commend to anybody and everybody. It's got a fantastic title. It's called When a Billion Chinese Jump. You see, it's written by a British journalist. When he was a little boy, he wouldn't go to bed on time. So his father said, you've got to say your prayers, and please pray that all the billion people in China don't jump at the same time. So what will happen if they jump? So when a billion people jump, the earth will start wobbling and you will fall off your bed. So he went to sleep. Many years later, he became a serious journalist. He went to China. He found 1 billion Chinese are jumping. They're not jumping literally. But the chapters of this book show that the transformation of the Chinese mountain, the river, the forest, the countryside, the city is identified, the environmental transformation, by the Chinese Communist Party. Not only the present Prime Minister, the last 3 have publicly stated that the greatest danger to political stability and social cohesion in China is environmental. In Delhi, where I live, we had a state of atmospheric emergency declared 2 years ago. Children were asked to wear masks. In China, children wear masks. They're beautiful masks. You'd love to catch hold of a Chinese child and say, hang on, give me the mask. They've got dragons and tigers. The parents and teachers are fined if they don't wear the masks. So I think the issues of air pollution, water quality, the destruction of lakes, the expansion of flood zones into areas because there's no space for the water to flow. So remember Mumbai, remember Chennai, remember Bangalore. I could expand that list to various cities in Southeast South Asia. I think the manner in which the cities are being designed and built is actually extracting a huge cost on the health, well-being and livelihood of its citizens. It begins with the poor, but please remember, it can't spare the rich. So 2 years ago, India Today put, it was a big hit on Instagram, a picture of a lung. There were 2 pictures, lung from Himachal, lung from Delhi. The lung from Himachal was all red, the one from Delhi was all black. And they had a frightening statistic. They said 1 out of 4 children in the greater metropolitan region of Delhi was getting medication to be able to breathe. The question actually I have, sir, is not at the global level. Of course, China should grow and India should grow. Why not? But is that growth going to come at the cost of the health of its children? It's very interesting to ask, what kind of society would deprive its children of the ability to run and play? And this is a question across the developing world. It's in Ibadan, it's in Ghana, it's in Indonesia, it's in Yogyakarta. And there's another reason here. That model of urbanism was for cities where 1 million was large. Now you do the math and tell me how many Asian cities are 1 million plus. So actually our challenge is not that we should develop and grow. Can we develop and grow in a different way? Can we develop and grow in a manner that improves our state of well-being but reduces the footprint Not only the immediate, but the future one. And as far as Bangalore is concerned, sir, I think I would be a very brave and foolish man if I said I had an answer. But I think there are scholars in Azim Premji and other places who are engaged with citizens. These are changes which have to come about when citizens make governments wake up. When governments wake up, and they'll wake up when they think there's a crisis. You go and tell them everything's all right, they'll recite another famous song, very famous rock song sung by many people. It's called Don't Worry, Be Happy. They'll say that. That's what governments all over the world say. It doesn't matter if it's one-party government, multi-party government, government with or without a majority. But people should stop believing what anybody tells them and look at the reality around. And I have great hope in the ability of people to give that wake-up call. Now, what happens after that? You're right. I think we should discuss and carry that conversation on later. Sir, ma'am, please. Madam, corner. That corner. On the left. Sir? Take one. Please go ahead. Yeah, come to you in a minute. Sir.
I'm Alexander.
Yes, sir.
There's a lot of discussion going on when people are talking about alternative feedstock and biorenewables. What is your take on biomass being an alternative for fossil fuel?
I wish I had a one-line answer. I'm not an expert on energy. But I do think that at this particular moment in time, we should ask what the question is. And one of the questions we need to ask is, the biomass which we hope will provide the alternative to fossil fuel, how much of the biomass will we need for energy? Is that biomass already playing a very important role? Is it being used, I don't know, for chaff for cattle? Is that biomass important in the ecological system? So anything we take away is coming at a cost. So I think we need to think about that a little more. And there was a time we went through a period when we were told nuclear energy will solve all problems. Then we were told solar energy will solve all problems. I'm not sure what problem each of these is to solve. Is the question of energy only about supply and demand? Or is it about how the energy is distributed, how it is consumed, and whether we can reduce its ecological footprint? So I think we need to frame the question, if you'll pardon me, sir, in a little wider way, and then we can look at whether biomass can perhaps provide part of the answer. It may. Yeah, there was a question here. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Chipra.
Yes, sure.
There were several insights that I think I received from your talk. Thank you for that. One of the things that struck me the most and will make me think is that human intervention or human impact on the environment has not been only destructive, but also constructive and transformational is what I heard you say. Could you provide some examples of what you mean by the last two words that you used? And any resources on how I can read more and learn more about that?
Well, I think one of the big things we tend to forget is that humans across the world have historically lived with a lot of animals. So there's a lot been written about Pleistocene extinctions. You know how early hunters wiped out large populations, and I gave you the instance of Australia. But it's extraordinary when you think about it. In much of Africa, there were no large mammal extinctions till the last 400 years. Now, this is not because all the mammals and the people, danced around campfires together and said we're all buddies. It isn't. A lot of animals were killed. Some people were killed by animals. It's because somehow they learned how to avoid each other. And it's been suggested that a lot of the large African ungulates learned to coexist with humans. Now, when I say coexist, I'd rather use the term cohabit. I'm also struck by the fact that South Asia, which has, as you know, over a very large number of people, India alone has 1.2 billion, is also home to some 20 to 30,000 elephants, some 2,000 odd tigers, we are told a few hundred snow leopards and so many other animals. How do these people and animals cohabit? If you're interested, please go to the web and look at this incredible sequence of planet Earth, David Attenborough. It's a scene in Bombay. There are two fat pigs running along and there's a leopard stalking them. It manages to kill them, and there are three youngsters doing what a lot of youngsters and older people do today. They're chatting heavily on the cell phone. This leopard goes and hides in the bushes, and after they go away, it comes out and starts eating the pig, poor pig. But I think that the ability of humans to cohabit with nature is also significant. How is it we have cities which have endured for 500 years or 1,000 years and kept that space habitable and livable? Now, as you're well aware, in much of Africa and Asia, because we have sharply defined wet and dry seasons, on paper there's a lot of water, But there's a long dry season when there's no water. Now, I was quite struck. My distinguished colleague, Professor Sunil Kumar, now head of the Department of History in the University of Delhi, came and gave a talk some years ago. It had a fantastic title, completely misleading. It was called The Sultans of Delhi and the Riverine Plains. He showed that the Riverine Plains didn't supply any water to the Sultans of Delhi. The Sultans of Delhi derived their water from the 14th century, and this continues, by the way, till around the 1920th, through a series of check dams built on the ridge, the last part of the Aravalis, where the water runoff, sweet water, was protected. Now, of course, the numbers were smaller. They didn't have, showers and things in those times. They managed with much less water than we do. But this system of protecting the water source, keeping these check dams intact, they didn't know it, also worked because the forest of the ridge was intact. The river plain was not built on. And another reason they had water is because they could sink wells and get fresh sweet water, because the aquifer along the Yamuna, the large 22-kilometer stretch of the Yamuna in Delhi, the water went down and renewed the groundwater. There are a lot of very interesting estimates by scholars, including physicists and ecologists, showing how both the ridge and the river helped keep the water, surface, and the groundwater intact. And those dams which were built by these people, painstakingly, these drains, have been dismantled during the Commonwealth Games. This is a part of history. So I think this ability to keep landscapes livable, I see it in Hita Unnikrishnan's work and Professor Nagendra's work on Bangalore. A lot of these lakes which were in Bangalore were created through human labor. I come from Tamil Nadu, and as you know, Madurai, Ramanathapuram are very famous because they have lots of lakes and tanks. In the 1970s, when there was a big fear of the extinction of crocodiles, there's a lovely essay by Ram Whitaker on a day spent in Madurai. I thought Ram Whitaker, herpetologist, went to the Meenakshi temple. No, it's about sitting in a tank where there are enormous crocodiles. Now, these crocodiles over centuries colonized these areas. Other than pick up the occasional goat, we are told that the marsh crocodile likes goats and fish, but normally doesn't hunt humans. They're left alone. So I think that humans have transformed ecologies, not entirely for the worse. You see it in a second very important instance, which is that many human cultures have cohabited with what we call domestic animals. And these breeds, the zebu cow, the gir cow, the various breeds of buffalo or camel, are the result of human intervention. And today, when we talk of protection of biological diversity, we're not only talking of the wild strains of rice or the wild strains of wheat, we're talking about cultivars, animal and plant. So I think there's a huge wealth of literature on this. And related to this is the other dimension. It's not a coincidence that those who protected those water sources and dams and maintained them, or those who breed these buffaloes and cows or these cultivars, are people who are very closely related to the process of production. So I would argue that rather than only look for sources, we remind ourselves that people who produce can have different relationships with the environment. All production isn't destruction. But those processes of production need to be looked at. The environment is not just something to be consumed. It's not just, a tiger to see in Cobbett Park or what happens to my water. It's about people actually trying to earn a living, and in doing so, improving the environment, not only for themselves, but for others, and perhaps unintentionally for other species. So the crocodiles, when they say their prayers, can thank, the tank builders of so many hundreds of years ago who dug these thousands of tanks and expanded the habitat of the marsh crocodile. Sorry, any other questions? Yeah.
My name is Janani.
I'm sorry, where are you? Yes, please. Please go ahead.
In my last visit to Vietnam, I actually saw the impact of Agent Orange. You see a whole generation of youngsters born with physical deformities, and other than the fact that they are working in specialized labs and that kind of things, but there's nothing done. That was just insight. My question to you: how can you have an environmental and economic policy that is not dependent on the government or the manifesto that is put forward? So, for example, you have Donald Trump who wanted to kind of revive the Rust Belt, hence decided that coal energy and other traditional forms of energy need to be redeveloped, and hence mandated that he walked out of the Paris Environment Agreement. How does one ensure that in the future that you have environmental, and as it has an impact on the economic policies of a country, are long-standing and beneficial for not only the country but for the entire world?
I think both these questions are related. You see, those who are bearing the costs, in this case, the American working class, which may be white, but I don't think it's the color of the skin. These are people whose wage has effectively not grown for a long time. They have a certain set of skills, in this case producing, let's say, steel or mining coal in the Appalachians. And the manner in which the international agreements are structured is that their jobs may disappear. Now, we must be careful. The US is not the only country where this is happening. And in a sense, gentleman at the back was arguing that future jobs may be at risk in, let's say, China and India. Ask yourself a different question. Would this condition or situation look different if a living wage was guaranteed to these people even if they lost their jobs for at least a certain set of time, say 5 years or 10 years? Why not? It's been done. You want to know when? I'll remind you. After the Second World War, the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding of Japan was financed by the United States. Forget about bankrolling a few workers. They bankrolled entire countries. Why did they do it? Because they thought that the United States wants allies in these countries. You know the famous story? The Mexicans say, Yankee go home, Yankee go home, Yankee go home, but take me with you. So it's something like that. They, in order for their own self-interest and to expand American power, they felt it's better to have a zone of stability. And one of the fascinating things about American intervention, and you can tell I'm not a great admirer of American political or military power, but it has to be said that at least in Europe, the way they designed and facilitated food aid and the recovery of Europe is remarkable. It's very different from the end of the First World War. This was also done, of course, in Japan and in South Korea. Not North Korea because they regard it as an enemy nation. As you know, they fought a war. So I think that this is a larger challenge than about the environment. And I'm reminded of a very famous paper by Richard White, which we've been reading in my class the last week. It's a delightful paper. It's a very important paper. It relates exactly to the question you're asking, ma'am. It's about a sticker in the logging towns of the Pacific forests of America in Washington state. The loggers are very angry because logging was being stopped to protect a very rare species of owl. And the sticker said, are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living? It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that loggers who spend very long hours in the American forest logging are being pitted against owls. I would argue that both the logger and the owl are victims. They're victims. There's a phrase used in the Palestinian conflict about the Palestinians that they're victims of victims. Whether we agree with the Israeli state or not, few people would disagree whether the Jews were the victims of a ferocious attempt of virtually an intra-European civil war. The Jews who landed in Palestine were victims of that war. But they then chose to make victims of the Palestinians. The answer isn't whether you favor victim A or B. It's to how you get out of the situation where these two victims are reduced to fighting each other. The question isn't whether we keep the steel jobs and the coal jobs or increase the carbon load on the planet. That's Mr. Trump's way. And to be fair, it's the way of many environmentalists who say, we got to save the carbon dioxide at any cost. And let's be fair, many of us, not me, but I'm saying those kinds of environmentalists may have a carbon footprint much larger than that of those workers. So I think that this transformation has to be more fundamentally economic one. It's a question which states have to face. Now, since you did refer to him, and I have to refer to him, most powerful man on the planet, President Trump comes from a very particular strain of political thought, which believes that growth is good, that the earth's resources were provided by providence for man to use, exploit, and dominate. In his weaker moments, he's not known to being extremely well read in American history. He could have quoted a former governor of California, who later became two-term president of the United States. When asked about pollution, Ronald Reagan famously said, 80% of all pollution comes from plants and trees. He was referring to carbon dioxide. He was not aware that they emit oxygen in the day. So I think that there is a deep problem. He also said, when he was asked about the redwood forests, that if you have seen one redwood, you have seen them all. Now this view, please be clear, this equivalent to the view is held by political and business leaders of several stripes in several countries. They are not playing to the base that Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan were. So I think we are dealing with a very deep idea which reduces every question to a this or that. It's like being on a TV show. You know, the anchor knows that you're going to get the wrong answer either way. They're just waiting to tell you, actually you don't know anything, I know the answers. But I think we have to get away from this either or. And the only way to get away from the either or is to look at livelihood and the environment as two sides of the same coin, and not ask those people to bear this cost. And this is, of course, a huge change. We are asking for a fundamental shift, a meta shift in the way we think. And as we know, that's the most difficult transformation. If we can't change the way we think, then we'll be stuck with the old way of thinking. And so I would submit that we need to try and do that. And I don't know how we do it in particular cases, but I'd hope that would be a sort of a starting point for a journey. Sorry.
Hi,
where's the voice? Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bani.
We'll come to you in a minute. Yeah, please go ahead.
In some ways, what I'm going to ask is connected to what you were just talking about. As a historian, how important would you say is how we frame our relationship with nature? Do you think that's important? And do you think that's changed over time? From a time where we thought we were embedded in nature and thought that we had responsibility to and expectations of nature, to a point where we think that we're separate from nature, and therefore it's, as you said, it's provided by providence for us to exploit. I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
It's a difficult question, and I'm sure you'll agree its answer will take several doctoral theses. There are views that the Renaissance changed everything. There's another view that industrialization changed everything. Many years ago, a very famous historian wrote a paper in Science, a scientist wrote a paper on history in the journal Science, Lynn White Jr., he was a historian, and he argued that it all began with the Judeo-Christian ethic, because it promised domination over fowl and fish. But when we look back historically, we can find abundant evidence, both in religious belief systems and in secular belief systems, that humans are here to dominate, but that humans ought to strive for harmony. You see both. I'll give you a very interesting instance. You're all aware of the Valmiki Ramayana, very famous, very beautiful book. So look at this conversation. Very well-known trope. There are, as you know, Ramayana in 25 Asian languages. In each of them, there are 25 versions. But this incident is common to many of the versions. It's the conversation of Rama and Sita. So he tells her not to come to the forest. He says, what will you do in the forest? A forest is a wilderness. It's a place of desolation. It's a place of hardship. It's a place where, he says, great man-eating lions emerged from their caves and set out on their hunt. It's a place where there are great elephants who charge at anyone who enters the forest. He describes the great one-horned buffalo. And he says that you are a princess. The delicate soles of your feet will be pierced by the sharp kusa grass. So he sees the forest as a place of hardship. And in the Valmiki Ramayana, the phrase used for Rama Lakshmana is Vyagra Purusha. Vyagra is the tiger. Purusha is men. It says there were tigers among men. So when they went into the forest, the beasts of the forest fled, because they could see by the way they carried themselves that they were great warriors. So you can see hardship, desolation, pain, danger, dread. She was very clever. She said, the forest is not a place of desolation. The forest is a place of beauty. And if you are with me, it will not be a wilderness. She said the forest is a place where there are deer which come down to the lake to drink. and the lakes are full of lotuses. It's a place where there are bees humming, the charavaka birds singing. So you can see there are two views here in this very famous conversation. So I think this is a very old debate of whether you celebrate the beauty of nature or whether you dominate it. And as you can see, the question of how you define nature is also about the state of the mind. Depends on your company. She didn't want him to go alone. He thought that by coming with him, she would subject herself to hardship. So, having said that, there is very little doubt that today, now, 21st century, we are in a different phase. We are dependent for energy on fossil fuels to a greater extent than ever. We are living to a larger, in larger numbers than ever before in cities. We are also engaged in many parts of the world in occupations that take us away from something not available in this room. Think about it, natural light. This is new. This is not how humans have lived for most of our existence as a species. The next time one of us gets a backache, my paleontologist friends say, of course you're going to get a backache. I said, why? He said, you were designed as a bipedal omnivore. You become a sedentary creature. So he says your design, the basic design of your body is for a completely different set of functions. You're the result of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of design. And in the last 8,000 years, 200 years, you've completely changed the way your body can't keep pace with that change. So I think somewhere this cutting off from these natural processes, of course, deepens alienation. And as you can imagine, poets and writers and novelists have thought about this for centuries. And read Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement. What you're struck by are not his views on global warming. He's drawing on work of scientists. But how the question of the distancing from nature has been dealt with by people in the literary cultures, by philosophers, by poets, and of course, by novelists. So I think what you're asking, ma'am, is a fundamental question of human condition. We should continue to debate it. But I think one of the questions, of course, is how do we overcome that alienation? How do we recreate or reinvent those relationships? And I'm sure there are as many answers as there are people. There can't be one answer possibly. So.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sachin, and mine's a slightly applied question. What do you think about ecosystem services in thinking about the ecological present? And do you think there are instances in early modern history of that kind of a thinking? Thank you.
Gosh, it's a difficult question. Early modern history, I'm not so sure. If one looks at this period broadly, 1500 to 1800, directly, yes. You can look at Venice protecting the forests, which were important for timber. You could look at such instances. You could look at game parks where rulers hunted for pleasure. You could look at groves or ponds or fishing zones which were set aside by people who lived around there. For various reasons, they could be sacred, they thought it would renew their supply. But I'm not sure the concept of ecosystem services existed till, let's say, the last 25, 30 years. And it has been deployed. So the city of New York pays a lot of money to the national forests of the Appalachians. Not widely known, but Vasant Sabharwal shows that the Bakranangal Dam and the Byas Satluj Control Board pays money to the Forest Department of Himachal for protecting the forests on the slopes. So there are such cases. And of course, the issue of ecosystem services or the idea can be deployed. The instance I gave on Delhi, a very important paper in current science, showed the amount of water that is recharged in the aquifer. But I would hesitate on only one issue, which is putting a monetary cost. Whatever the monetary cost that you put on the ecosystem services of Corbett Park will probably be overcome by the toll fee that you will collect on that wonderful highway, or by the a tax on the vehicles that go through it. So I'm a little hesitant to get into monetary value. I mean, ask yourself, suppose the ecosystem services of clean air in Delhi were very low. Let's just assume that. Do we still want 1/4 of the children having respiratory problems? Can one quantify that? I don't think so. I would argue it's beyond value. So one of the deeper transformations is, rather than look at ecologies in terms of services, can we look at ecologies, a notion of ecological integrity, which is important to the human condition. This is not as complicated as it sounds. When you think about it, human societies have often rallied together to protect a river, a mountain, a lake, a forest, because they felt that its destruction would deprive them of something special to their condition. Think of, the movement in Sikkim against the building of a dam, which would flood a valley next to the Kanchenjunga. The Kanchenjunga is very important in Sikkimese culture for a range of people in Sikkim. They don't agree on a lot of other things, but they all agreed it would be a really bad idea if this dam came up and harmed the greater Kanchenjunga landscape. Well, I can give you several such instances. But yes, I think the issue of ecosystem services will continue to be debated. We are living in an era when such issues are being debated. So.
Hello, sir. My name is Nishok. I think in addition to environmental history, you should also probably start teaching rhetoric and public speaking. That's
Thank
just
you.
an aside.
Thank you.
In your talk, there was a lot of emphasis on the changing industrialization patterns and urbanization and so on, which is, of course, happening at a really, really unprecedented and rampant scale. But what I really found missing was this one dimension which has come up in the last 5-10 years. I might be wrong by the numbers, but this growing optimism, in fact sickening optimism amongst a particular group of humans, which is also increasing, about this fact of interplanetary existence and migrating from the earth and going to other planets and establishing habitations there. I mean, how does one respond to such challenges, because these people seem to have completely lost out hope on this planet, thinking that of course nothing can be done about it, and this earth is going to hell and so on and so forth. But I mean, it's almost scary to even listen to these discourses when these people talk of these developments, and they talk of it in a really, really optimistic and hopeful fashion. So how does one respond to these challenges?
No, I think techno-optimism is built into the modern condition. You may recall remarkable film, which I commend to you if you haven't seen, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Very great film. Arthur C. Clarke wrote the original novel. And in that film in 2001, humans are in the moon and etc. But even if this were to happen conceivably over the next century, a section of humans journeys to other planets and lives there. I think very few people in this room would argue that the majority of humanity will have that option. So added to all the other forms of inequality, we'll add to that people who have the wealth to live on another planet and those who are stuck on this one. So I don't think it even begins to answer the question. The question isn't how a particular person will survive. The easiest way to solve a problem is to run away from it. So interplanetary flight may be a way to run away from it. But I'm also struck by the deep pessimism inherent in this thought. Two reasons. One, I think we underestimate in the 1940s and 50s or 60s how real the threat of nuclear war was. One of the major impulses beyond the movement to disarm was that the world was actually very close to the brink, certainly in 1962. One of the other impulses was that in the 1980s, the two superpowers, the then superpowers, embarked on a massive arms race. And one of the reasons that by the late 1980s, for the first time, they not only capped the number of weapons they would build, they started dismantling their weapons, is because this fear, and this was not just a fear that a lot of people would die in a nuclear war, it was the beginning of the realization that this war would damage life as we know it, that it could damage the planetary support system for life. You may recall the term nuclear winter, first used by American and Soviet scientists working together. That's how the dinosaur extinction entered the debate. We were told dinosaurs died due to the nuclear winter. We can't ask the dinosaurs, we don't know. We leave that to the scientists. So I think the nuclear disarmament movement, the fact that it finally succeeded even partially, should give us cause for hope. But there's a second, and I'm really struck. that very few of us recall it. Not a fashionable figure today, Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm not saying it because I was director Nehru Memorial Museum, etc., etc. But in 1963, India was one of the signatories to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere and in the oceans because in the 1950s, scientists confirmed that the radioactive substances released by these tests, Caesium-37, strontium-90, were present in the bone marrow of every child, woman and man on earth. It didn't matter whether you were Chinese or Greek, Zulu or Eskimo, Indian or Pakistani, you had it there. And in his book, 1,000 Days, Arthur Schlesinger, remarkable man, he was a professor of history who had a job in the White House. They've never hired one after. He took notes of every meeting he was in. The president was assassinated, he wrote a memoir. It's a very moving sentence in that memoir. Jack Kennedy is listening to his scientific advisor, Ratzinger, who's droning on about nuclear fallout. And suddenly Kennedy had something many of us should get, a rocking chair. You know, if you're president of the United States, you can have a rocking chair, you can rock on it. And he stopped the rocking chair. And he said, please say that again. He said, are you telling me that nuclear fallout is there in the White House lawn where my daughter and son come out to play? He said, yes. He said, it's the first time I've understood this problem. Thank you. So I think that there is a lot of hope if countries of the world can agree to cap nuclear weapon testing and start building down nuclear weapon systems. Now this doesn't mean that everybody is agreed on everything. I'm not saying that. But it's a very big step. 1987, Ronald Reagan, I quoted him and everybody laughed, but Ronald Reagan had his good points. One of them was that he liked to keep the companies that funded the Republican Party happy. In fact, he wanted them to be even happier. And he did that in 1987. DuPont, one of the great funders of the Republican Party, was very happy because he signed the Montreal Protocol. CFCs were phased out across the world by transferring technology and funds from the developed to the developing countries. And over time, we are told 20, 30 years later, there are signs that the hole in the ozone layer closed. It's a happy coincidence. The interests of DuPont, Republican Party, President Ronald Reagan, scientific community, people in the ozone layer coincided. So I would argue that rather than, give up hope on the planet, that's the easy way out and run away from the problem because the problem will not get solved. You may run away, but what are you running away from? And who are you going to leave behind? You're going to take your grandchildren with you? Or take your best friend with you? Or say bye-bye, goodbye to the planet? In fact, if you're interested, there's a series of novels by Isaac Asimov where Earth is full, the naked sun, the caves of steel. There are these spacers who are very privileged and the Earth guys who are underprivileged. The rest of the novels you can read, I can't tell you. Take one last question. Yeah, sure.
One.
So.
Okay.
The mic.
Hello, my name is Manjunath.
Sir.
Really, I enjoyed your talk. Anyway, in next 1 week, Gandhi Jayanti is coming. So Gandhi's word is that nature can give what we need, but not for what is our greed. How much it is relevant for this topic?
Enormously relevant. I'm so happy you asked me this question. Late 1920s, Gandhiji is in conversation with Saklatwala, who was a Parsi communist. He was elected to the House of Commons. And Saklatwala evidently wrote to him about the importance of industrialization. And Gandhiji famously wrote that the English way of life without English rule would be like the tiger without its stripes. And if India, 300 million people adopted the style of living of the British Isles, it would strip the earth like a pack of locusts. And I think there's something very deep there. The belief that there can be infinite growth on a finite planet, that through industrialization, you will break the bonds of the earth, was a deep idea in the 1920s. It probably has even more adherence today among the rulers of the different nation states on earth. But the clarity with which he put this idea up continues to be significant. And my submission would be that the reindustrialization of America, the idea that every country can catch up with the other is, if it continues in its present mode, going to make these Gandhian ideas even more relevant. Having said that, we have to take those principles and ask how to actualize them in our time. I think that is subject for another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Much of the beauty of this public lecture series is the question-answer series. While the distinguished speakers speak for about 45 minutes, the remaining 30-35 minutes of questions often decides what kind of quality we achieve out of a public lecture. Thank you very much, because what we got out of is actually 2 lectures out of Mahesh when we had actually budgeted for 1. Thank you once again. Mahesh, thanks a lot. It was absolutely marvelous. I just, while doing this customary vote of thanks, I want to add one information that may be interesting to all of us. On the 3rd of October, the Azim Premji University is releasing its first annual State of Working India report, which is all about livelihoods and employments. I'm sure it must be of interest to all of you. I think notices and communications are going out, but just record it in your diary that it's the 3rd of October at the Terry Auditorium. We're doing it in partnership with BIC, Bangalore International Center, and we're doing it at Terry Auditorium. Its hall capacity is only about 90 or around 90, so that could be a challenge, but we look forward to having you all there. Thanks once again for a marvelous day today. Thanks, Mahesh.